Well, hello, everybody. This is our first commissioners meeting for the Public Works Department, January 11th, 2023 for this year, at 6:30 p.m. in the council chambers, which is very nice. Let's keep that going for the rest of the year. South Pasadena Public Works Commission Statement of Civility. As your elected governing board, we will treat each other, members of the public, and the city employees with patience, civility, and courtesy as a model of the same behavior. We wish to reflect on South Pasadena for the conduct of all city business and community participation. The decisions made tonight will be for the benefit of South Pasadena community and not for personal gain. Notice of public participation and accessibility. The South Pasadena Public Works Commission meeting will conduct an in-person meeting at the council chambers located in our South Pasadena city chambers. And we actually have three emails that came in from the Public Works Department, from the public, which is wonderful, residents. One pertaining to a topic regarding to improve the streets, and then two regarding our West Side Reservoir. We're not going to read them, but we appreciate the public comments tonight, and they will be posted on our website. And Ted, obviously you've read those and are reviewing them accordingly. So again, I want to thank the residents of South Pasadena for providing input on today's meeting. Call to order. But before I do, we have a new commissioner on board, Ryan Jones. So welcome, Ryan, to the family. And with that said, Evelyn, I'll hand it off to you on the roll call.
Hi.
Oh.
Raina.
Raina. I saw Evelyn. But Evelyn, if you like, just joking.
Good
ahead,
evening, everybody. Chair Malling.
Present.
Vice Chair Catania.
Present.
Commissioner Hernandez.
Present.
Commissioner Trevino.
Present.
Commissioner Jones.
Present.
Thank you.
And with that said, I think we have our staff present today, Ted Gerber from the Director of Public Works, Anesh, Public Works Deputy Director, and Raina as well. And with that said, Raina, shall we go with the Pledge of Allegiance?
Yes, thank you.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good. We are moving quick here tonight. It's our 2023 goal. So I did talk about public comments. We do have three. And again, want to thank the residents for submitting those, and they will be posted accordingly. And with that said, we will hand it off to action items accordingly. Raina.
Thank you. And just to note, there are no public comments tonight in person. Public comments have been posted on this website. Okay, so action item number 2, update on recommendation on the West Side Reservoir seismic and structural evaluation presented by Ted Gerber.
Thank you, Raina. And if you don't mind pulling up the presentation on the screen, that would be helpful. Thank you. Good evening, Commissioners. So tonight we're going to review a study that we conducted in 2022 on the West Side Reservoir. Council had requested that we take a look at this reservoir, which stores potable drinking water. It was built in the 1960s. And so the purpose of this evaluation is to take a look at the existing condition and provide some recommendations based on the condition and how the reservoir would react in a seismic event. And so we conducted this evaluation. If you could turn to the next slide, Raina. The reservoir, you may be familiar with it. It's kind of hidden in the city, so not many people have seen it. But if you're traveling south on Meridian, south of Mission, and you head west on Gillette Crescent, which is kind of a curved semicircle street, there is a street, Glen Place, and you'll see it on the corner of this, or on the side of this picture here, that leads to the West Side Reservoir. So it's a circular reservoir on top of a platform on that hill. It's a 2 million gallon capacity reservoir, 105 feet in diameter. And it's a unique type of build, this particular reservoir. Whereas our other reservoirs in the city, Garfield, or outside the city, Wilson, Graves, they're cast in place concrete reservoirs where we basically build a rebar cage and then we cast concrete for rectangular structures. And then our grand reservoir, which is a pair of steel tanks. West Side Reservoir is also a concrete structure, but it's a tendon pre-stress concrete structure, which means that in addition to the interior concrete rebar supported reinforced wall, there are cables basically wrapped around it, which we call tendons, and they're tightened in order to give additional structural strength to the reservoir. And so this allows you to build a stronger reservoir in a smaller circular space, because as you can see from this picture, it's kind of difficult to see because of the topography, but that's a steep slope down from the reservoir. And so it's basically got this very small, relatively small footprint, and there's not a lot of space around the reservoir. There's an asphalt roadway around it for access, but it's a small footprint. And so it's an older reservoir. It was built in 1960s, 1963, I think was around the time. And it's the oldest reservoir in the city. Most of the other reservoirs have been rebuilt in recent years. Next slide, Raina, thank you. So the evaluation conducted of several phases. First, there was the document review in which we provided the consultant with the as-built drawings of the reservoir. And so with that information, they were able to, they took that information to include in their seismic and structural evaluation. But before they did that, we had a geotechnical survey company come on site and conduct borings into the ground. So they drilled 2 holes into the ground, both to collect soil and also to determine the different levels of sedimentation of soil and rock structure below the surface. The next part included a dive inspection. So with the reservoir filled, we had divers who are sanitized so they can enter into this drinking water reservoir to go in and dive underwater and actually inspect the floors, the columns, the walls, the ceiling, and also all the other pipe work and other components inside the reservoir, and give us a condition report on those elements. And then lastly is the seismic and structural evaluation. So taking the information from the geotechnical, collecting the information from the internal condition and the external condition of a walk around site inspection, as well as the as-built drawings, applying building codes, and then taking a look at other information available, such as nearby soil information, fault locations. The consultant conducted an overall comprehensive evaluation of everything in order to give us some recommendations about the condition of the reservoir and essentially next steps. Next slide, Raina, thank you. So as I mentioned, the inspection components, if you could think of this thing, it's basically like a can, like a tuna can. So it's got a floor, it's got a ceiling. Basically, there's a floor slab, like a flat floor slab, which is built on top of basically a ring footing. And then on top of that is an interior wall. And then there is tendons wrapped around that interior wall. And then there's an exterior concrete wall around that. And then on top of all that is a roof that's placed on top. And there's 7 columns inside the can, inside the reservoir, 1 in the center and then 6 around it. So as you can see from that earlier picture, it's the reservoir has this sombrero effect, whereas there's some sagging in the roof because it's still supported from those columns. They're still intact, but the areas between the columns and then between the walls is sagging. So all in all, the evaluation showed that many of those components are somewhere between poor and fair condition. There are elements of the reservoir that are in good condition. The floor, for example, was intact and in good condition. The exterior walls were in poor to fair condition. The interior walls were in good condition, and then the roof was in poor to fair condition. And so, for example, you could see that for the ceiling, there's concrete that's spalling, that's breaking off in little chunks off of the ceiling, and they found those during the dive inspection on the floor. So you have that floor component, and then you have the wall, roof, columns, and here you'll see on this slide joint sealant. So between all those components is basically a sealant that gets jammed into the crevices to pull everything to hold to basically seal up the inside of the reservoir and the outside of the reservoir. And then within it, we have pipes, there's ladders, and other metallic components inside the reservoir. So there's a drain pipe, there's a fill pipe, and you'll see actually most of this in the next slide. Yes, if you can go to the next slide, Raina. So here's some of the photos. So on the upper left, you can see this is outside of the reservoir. So you can see that ceiling that hangs over the exterior wall and some gaps between, you can see the joint sealant and some gaps there. In the second column of photos, you could see some of the concrete damage and spalling. And again, the exterior is in poor to fair condition, but they think the interior wall is actually in better condition. And then you can see on the bottom, second column there's some spalling. That chunk of concrete is coming out. And that usually occurs because the rebar is corroding. And so when that rebar corrodes, it creates like an oxidation product that sort of pops the concrete. And then once more water gets in there, it can fall off. So it hasn't failed, but you can see that it is in the process of decomposing, of failing.
Ted, just a question.
Yes.
How thick is the outside wall and how thick is the inside wall?
Sure. I think the outside wall is 6 inches, 8 inches, and then the inside wall is 4, 6. The whole thing's 8 inches. Okay, yeah. So I think it's somewhere between 4 and 4 or 6. Yeah, something like that.
Overall, it's 8 inches.
8 inches. Overall, it's 8. Yeah. Thanks, Antenna. So in the third column, you can actually see one of the internal columns, which were a relatively good condition. None of them have failed. And then you could see on the bottom, there's the floor where we see debris and little chunks of concrete that have spalled off the roof. And lastly, on the right, you could see some of the appurtenances, the pipes, and you can see there's a joint fitting right there that's corroding. And then a pipe that exits the reservoir. I think that's one of the, is that one of the drain lines right there? No. Yeah, that's the overflow line right there on the bottom right. So in terms of condition, and we'll get into this at the end of the presentation, but there would be an advisement to replace most of this corroding infrastructure if we were to keep the reservoir. There would also be a need to replace the joint sealant to fix the spalling concrete and to remove the sediment from the reservoir. Let's jump to the next slide. So the third step in the evaluation was the geotechnical analysis. So there's a very comprehensive geotechnical report attached to the overall seismic and structural report. So at the moment, we have a draft report, and we're evaluating the report author's comments, and we'll be basically finalizing that report. And with your recommendation to move forward to the next step, we'll bring all that documentation to council, release the report to the public for review, and then move on to the next step. You can see here's just a small excerpt from the report that shows some of the findings from the geotechnical analysis. So you can see that B1 and that B2 in blue is where they actually conducted the borings to that depth to evaluate the soil structure. And one of the main findings that came out of the geotechnical and the seismic and structural analysis was that the reservoir was built on a very dense tertiary formation. And then it was backfilled around it. So what that means in terms of the stability of the reservoir is that though we would have concerns about the stability of this slope because it's a hillside developed structure, during a seismic event, we don't have as much concern. There's a negligible amount of concern with regard to the slope stability during a seismic event. In other words, there's not as much of a risk of, say, like the floor collapsing into the earth during a seismic event because the floor is in good condition and it's also settled into this tertiary formation, and that it's on basically the solid, what they would call like a soft rock, like a solid soft rock. I know that's kind of sounds redundant, but it's not like it's a bedrock formation, but it's kind of like a dense clay, dense sand.
I guess the question is, and a little bit of pile drilling that we've done, we have to go down to bedrock.
Yes.
Are we anywhere near bedrock?
Yes, they would classify this green area as bedrock. Yeah. So and so the brown area is actually the backfill. So they built the reservoir on top of that bedrock and then filled in around it afterwards. Okay, let me jump to the next slide here. So those are all really brief overviews of the different segments of the report.
What's the depth of the tank right now?
It's about 30 feet deep into the soil.
30.
Yeah. So in taking a look at the condition and taking a look at the seismic response of the reservoir during an event, the reservoir was essentially built to handle its static loads, meaning like it can handle the water that's contained inside it, but during a seismic event, it isn't built up to current standards. So in order to retrofit the reservoir and repair all of the components that you saw that were failing, those replacement costs actually approach the replacement costs of the entire structure. So from a cost perspective and from a building code perspective, the consultant's recommendation is to actually replace the entire reservoir. And we'll get into the costs on that in a couple seconds here. And as I said, it was essentially designed and constructed before AWWA, not just to 1961 building codes, which are no longer relevant, but it was also designed and built prior to AWWA adopting design standards for this type of reservoir. So as I mentioned, it's overall poor to fair structural condition. There are some good components to the reservoir, but largely when we classify the entire reservoir as in good condition. And as I mentioned, the repair costs would approach the replacement costs. So we have some deficient components, not deficient under static conditions, but deficient under an earthquake. So one of the elements of the seismic and structural evaluation was taking a look at what would happen to the reservoir during an earthquake. So we expect the slope to be seismically stable, but we also have 2 million gallons of water actually inside the reservoir that during an earthquake event would shake around and move. And so the modeling that the consultant did demonstrated that they would actually generate a 7-foot wave inside the reservoir during an earthquake. And as you had seen from some of the photos there, the top of the reservoir, the roof, is basically laid on top of the columns and on top of that interior and exterior cylindrical wall. So in essence, that type of wave under those types of seismic forces could actually, break or knock part of the roof off. So that was our primary concern operationally, was that the existing water level could cause that type of damage and danger during a seismic event.
How large of a seismic event?
So when we talk seismic events, the design standards aren't what you'd be used to in terms of like a Richter scale. They're actually evaluated in ground acceleration. So we're actually talking forces in G's, you know, like so they do this evaluation where they took a look at the average acceleration of the ground during the event. And if you could picture acceleration, it's basically the how fast something is moving and how fast it's moving faster, I guess you could say. So we measure acceleration in units of like meters per second squared. So you're driving your car and you're moving a distance over amount of time. And then when you hit the gas, you're moving faster and faster. So we measure we talk about the forces in a seismic event, about what's the level of that ground acceleration. So it doesn't really equate too much to a Richter scale. It's more about the forces and stresses on the reservoir, if that helps. So in addition to us having this issue with the wave, we're also concerned about some of these pre-stress tendons having possibly failed over time. And you could see with the deflection of the outer wall that some of the outer walls deflected, and that indicates that some of the tendons have failed, and now they're basically relying on the tendon above or below. And so combined with those two things, we're concerned about what would happen during the event with the water inside. So almost immediately after we discussed these findings with the consultant, we actually lowered the water level inside the well to below that 7 foot threshold. So if there is a seismic event and we do generate that internal wave, it won't reach the height as to hit the ceiling, basically. So we're going to continue our best to operate the well under those conditions moving forward. Fortunately for us right now, it's during the winter months, so it's easy for us to reduce the amount because we don't have to store as much water as we do during the summer. But how that operation will work moving forward is actually part of our next set of recommendations here. So let me jump to the next slide here.
And to prevent the wave, and I'm not an engineer, baffles inside to prevent a wave structure to be built up, it's thought. And if you fill the tank, the reservoir, all the way to the lid, do you not eliminate that wave?
Sure. So it's not so much what you would think of as in terms of breaking the wave that's the issue. It's the force of the wave itself. So even if we were to install any type of baffle structure inside the reservoir, that structure would be subject to the pressure of the wave. And it might take some of the force off of it, but we would still have that force moving inside the reservoir. And then filling the reservoir up to the top doesn't necessarily compress that wave. It still basically jostles that water around enough that it would kind of swing around and knock the top off. So really all we could do is reduce the amount of water and reduce its ability to rise up in that way.
Thank you.
Of course. So before we get into the next steps and the recommendation, these are some of the replacement costs estimated by the consultant. So all in all, they estimated a little over $6 million for the replacement of the reservoir. You can see that includes the structure itself. But a lot of the costs here are actually due to the location. In order for us to replace this reservoir, because of the limited footprint of that location, Commissioner Trevino, yes.
Yes, Ted, I have a question. You have about roughly 6 to 7 acre feet of water in there. Not a lot of water, but and the bigger scope of things. I guess my question is, how important is that reservoir to the emergency sustainability of the city in the long term? How important is that? Because that reservoir, it's an older reservoir, 2 million acre feet, 2 million gallons is not a lot of water, really, when it comes to a disaster.
It's a really great question. Essentially, we use that reservoir as, for lack of a better term, like backup water for the Southwest Hills. As we're supplying water from our sources in San Gabriel and San Marino, we store water in the West Side Reservoir. And then we draw upon it when we're not pumping from our groundwater sources. So I don't know if you want to add to this. Before you jump in, as the city is divided into the 5 pressure zones, we have an increased need for higher pressure in the Southwest Hills. And so we have to basically take the main supply from the central zone system and up the pressure into that zone. And so having the West Side Reservoir up there allows us to maintain head in that area for that pressure zone. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more?
Absolutely.
Sure.
So this reservoir is a forebay for all the water demand in the Altos, or the Biliki zone as we call it. Their daily demand ranges from 700,000 to about 1 million per day. So in case of emergency, not only does it act as a forebay, but all the water from our wells will be stored here. So if you can imagine, we can't get water into the city, this is like our backup to make sure there's ample water for the residents to consume.
I guess the question is, if it's only,
2 million.
that amount of water.
Yeah.
And how long would that reservoir be a viable alternative in case of emergency? For how many days, or how many weeks?
It's part of our overall storage here in the city. In case of emergency, you want to look at how much gallons of water do you have in the city?
And
So-
to add to that antenna, it's the storage for that particular zone
Correct.
in the Biliki zone in the Southwest Hills. So maybe 2 million gallons wouldn't be substantial in terms of the entire city supply.
Correct. In addition to being the forebay for that Biliki zone, West Side Reservoir also acts as a pressure sustainer for the west end of the central zone. So because it's higher in elevation compared to the ground, it actually adds pressure to the areas of Meridian and all that area. So if you take that out, they will lose pressure, so to speak. Yeah. So it has multiple purposes.
It plays
Not
that role, not so
ex-
much the storage, but the ability to be able to act as a pressure.
Pressure sustainer, yes. It's multi-purpose. It's not just one thing it does several things. combined.
So 2 things to consider on that. So number 1, as far as an ability to increase the pressure in that area, with West Side, and we haven't mentioned this yet, but there's also a pump station located at West Side. There's our Indiana pump station, which is essentially our backup system to West Side, even though there's no storage at the Indiana pump station.
Right, so Indiana is at Monterey and Indiana. That's just the pump station, so the city's water system is redundant. Let's say you have power outage at West Side Reservoir. Immediately you need water, so then you kick in the Indiana pump station to provide that. It pumps, water to that zone. If that one is out, then we have a generator at West Side. So it's one of those things where you always have to make sure there's water available and have a redundant system to
You
it.
have a redundant system, that's.
Exactly.
I was gonna say that,
Yes,
yeah, that, I understand it now.
Okay.
Fine, okay.
So the only item I'll point out about that is that, as Antenna mentioned, because of the, some of the pressure, sustaining the pressure in the West Side area is what we use the Biliki tank for in terms of
right.
maintaining a higher level of pressure. But
Or
like
the-
you had mentioned for the West Side Reservoir, maintaining pressures in the central zone below the hills. So if we were to demolish the West Side Reservoir and take it out of service in order to rebuild it, we'd still have a need for some sort of water storage on that site in order to maintain pressures.
Correct, during construction.
Yeah.
So it really
During,
plays a greater role than just a reservoir.
Mhm.
It's a monitoring, moves water.
It
and
does
the
several
forebay
things.
is, important. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
So with that said, we have the costs to replace the reservoir. And then we also have the ancillary costs associated with that, basically demolishing it, removing it, excavating, and then backfilling around the new reservoir after it's constructed. So the consultant estimated this to be a little over $6 million. Now, in our capital improvement budget, we actually have about $15 million identified for this project, because as we had mentioned, there's other site improvements that would need to occur, including the piping on the site and also the pump station, which isn't included in this estimate.
Do we have that 15 million in the bank?
So we don't have that 15 million in our possession like today, but the way this would work is, number one, we would seek funding from the state, like grant types of funding. The way we've built our last reservoir is by basically getting a low interest capital improvement loan from the state as well that we would pay off over time. And then we would use some of the ratepayers buy into basically new capital improvements with what they pay in their water rates. So in essence, we have a funding plan of how we would accomplish that. It would take decades to basically pay off the reservoir, but not like a cash amount that we have.
But we have
available.
accessibility if we decide to do a major a replacement. We've got the ability to do.
Yes. Now, I will say that combined with all the other projects that we have, including other water projects, including replacing water mains across the city, would probably require a fairly extensive plan. The One Water master plan that we drafted and brought to council in 2022 identified roughly over the next 30 years for water infrastructure alone. I think the bill's upwards around 175, 180 million for, you're talking about 80 miles of water pipes, West Side Reservoir replacement, upgrades at places like Indiana Pump Station, minor upgrades at, say, like the Coley Station, where we basically take on water from Metropolitan, as well as other types of infrastructure projects, including the water tanks and things like that.
Ed, are you looking also at Prop W money? Is that something that you?
Yeah, we have for some of the stormwater projects in that plan. Yes, we have. And actually we had several applications in this year to be considered for that. So we're hoping that we have, and that will offset the costs for some of these potable water projects. So yeah, that's an excellent comment.
Will the existing pump station handle a new reservoir?
We expect that we would want to replace that pump station as well. We didn't include photos or a condition assessment of that pump station in this presentation. But it was built around the same time as the reservoir. There's pumps that leak. The building itself needs to be replaced. So that would also have to be considered in the capital improvement.
And there's no estimate on the cost of that.
We think altogether, the whole site would cost about 15 million. Well, I think we put like 15.5 or something like that in the budget. So how do we get there? Let's jump to the next slide. So we're looking at, to get to construction, obviously we have to go through design, and to get to design, we have to know how this is going to come together. So what the consultant is recommending is that we moved on to a preliminary design report. And what that would do, basically give us a roadmap to get to design and construction. If we're going to bid out a design package, we'll want to have certain parameters in place for that designer on how we want to go about the construction. Do we continue with this pre-stressed tendon cylindrical tank design because of the space, or is there another opportunity to do something else with that site? How would we handle the demolition and the removal from the site, and how would we basically operate, as Antenna had mentioned, operate the site in such a way that can still support the surrounding community while there's no reservoir there, and while the pump station is being rebuilt as well. So these are the types of things that we need to evaluate ahead of time before we move into the design process. So we don't have a estimated amount for this preliminary design report yet. There's other things that we want to consider, including energy, power backup, site security, other types of improvements that we want to make that might increase the efficiency of our operations. And then we also want to try to expedite this project as much as possible. So instead of going through the typical design, bid construction, project delivery approach, we'd like to see if there's an opportunity to do something along the lines of a design build where the same firm does the design and can actually fast track some of the construction elements while design is commencing, and then build the reservoir faster and typically cheaper. So that's what we're recommending on the consultant's advice, is to move next to a preliminary design report. So our next move, with your recommendation to support that, would be to finalize the scope for that preliminary design report, finalize this seismic and structural evaluation report, bring the report to council with the recommendation to appropriate a budget for that, and then move into the preliminary design report stage. So I will say that the budget for this seismic and structural report was about $100,000. We didn't spend all of that, so we could use some of that money to move into the preliminary design report. But we don't expect these reports to be, they're on the order of tens of thousands of dollars in order to move on to the next step. So this is my first presentation back since I think December, so a little rocky, but thanks for your patience. But any questions you have, glad to answer them.
So, Ted, let's talk about this. With regards to your inspections, it said port affair. So I think you would conclude that it's important that we do a replacement. And from what I'm understanding, we should do a replacement sooner than later. There's obviously residents that have been following you that are also supporting this accordingly. So number one, I think you're in agreement that we should move forward, and you're going to be making this recommendation after we agree to the city council. Talk to us about timing once the city council gives you approval to move forward. And then lastly, would it be the same type of design, or is there a way to incorporate, because I'm looking at that big piece of real estate, me being in real estate, I'm like going, hey, can we bury this reservoir and turn this into a park? I don't know if that's something that can ever be done or can be incorporated in the design, if it's a necessity or something, amenity that we could do. I always think amenities for the residents. So I just wanted to throw that out there too. So again, getting back to, since I think you want to move forward on this, what would the timing be once you get approval from the city council? And then what type of alternative designs would there be?
Sure. So those are good questions. So I think this report took us about 4 or 5 months to come to bring together. And it was, there was a lot of technical evaluation. This next report would be sort of an evaluation of best practices. So it probably is that timeline or a little less, a few months on order. And so we would expect to be able to finish that report this fiscal year so that we could move into design next fiscal year. Now, that's going to take some time, that design, because it also has to basically, it has to be accompanied with an operational plan. And this will tie into my comment about other amenities. It's a very unique site in that we have a lot of hillside development challenges, where our other reservoirs have been on mostly a flat and clear site, with the exception of maybe like the retaining wall structures around Grand Reservoir. This is going to be a sort of a complicated design, and operationally, the construction sequence is going to be very important. So our hope is that if we can get that preliminary design report done this fiscal year, we can move into design for 23, 24. And then if we have the funding associated with that, we'd be looking at construction 25, 26. So that is a fairly expedited schedule as it is.
Yeah.
But with the recommendations from the consultant to basically alter the operation of the reservoir, they're not telling us to take it out of service, but they're telling us to change our operation and then immediately move into the reconstruction efforts. We think that's the most appropriate way to go. Now, with regard to the site, we have the same thought in mind as to how to best use the site. So right now we have the reservoir, we have the pump station. We actually have somewhat of a warehouse to store materials on site because honestly, this is one of our few properties that we can use for city operations. We have the Garfield site over here, which is mostly a reservoir. There's a 6 million gallon reservoir on the Garfield site. And actually that's where most of our public works staff is staged. And then we have a tiny sliver of property over at the Mission Yard next to the rec center where we house our facilities and sewer and street operations. So we actually don't have a lot of space ourselves. So if we can enhance some of our operations on that site, we would, as far as like storage for maybe some equipment and materials. But let's keep in mind that it's a largely residential area. There's residences surrounding the entire reservoir. And then there's the residents along Glen Place and Gillette Crescent below. So we don't intend to use the site more than we are right now in terms of visiting it for water operations, but don't want to turn it into any sort of like busy area for either for public works operations or and we don't really think it's feasible for community usage because we basically have this one way in and out. So it is a good thought. It could be a good site for solar power generation because of the amount of space we have, even though it is hillside. And so there's may not so much usable space, that you can actually build something on. We might be able to add some solar capacity that could actually assist with the pump station power usage at the site. So a lot of these things are some of the things we want to get into the scope of that preliminary design report.
Well, I think, as Commissioner Mallon said, at the end of the day, we're looking at replacing this reservoir, not repairing.
Absolutely, yes.
And there's no way to just eliminate this reservoir altogether. We need it. Okay.
Yeah, we need a facility there for water operations for many reasons, among them storage. And as Commissioner Trevino said, not a massive amount of storage, but enough to maintain the head and maintain some backup in the system when we're not able to produce water. And then certainly as a pressure station in the system.
At this reduced level, can it go on indefinitely, or does that cut its usefulness entirely?
It doesn't cut its usefulness. It just basically means we have less storage available. So in a circumstance where in the summer, when we're trying to produce as much water as possible, and say we have a maintenance issue at one of our producing pumps where we basically usually come into a situation where we're still producing some water, but then we're slowly drawing down the storage capacity in the city. It just means we have less to draw on at West Side. So it just reduces our redundancy. If that makes sense.
Would you
Yeah.
build it any larger or smaller? Could you?
That's something that we want to work with the consultant on, is if there's a cost benefit to increasing the storage on the site. For every, gallon of water we add, obviously the construction costs go up. And so it's always better for us to be able to have more storage, but there's a limiting factor on the site and the cost benefit of that.
And I only think because you're reducing it by, I think you said 7 feet, and I don't know what the terminology would be in acre
So
water.
what's that, an acre? Yeah.
Well, if we have 30 feet now, roughly, and we take away 7 foot of it, That's probably about maybe 15%.
Yeah, but it's on a daily use, so it's
Oh.
gonna be a challenge for the operators in summer. But we have come across these kind of issues in the past, so they just have to be more smart in how to, you
Manage.
know, operate the demand for each zone on a daily basis based on what they produce and where they send that water. Yeah, that's manageable for now
Okay.
until we reconstruct it, but once it's reconstructed, it's going to go back to 2 million, if possible more. Does that
How
answer?
long do you think it's the timeframe? I mean, if everything went in clockwork, tearing it down and building a new one, what are you looking at? And do we have, are we able to do that?
I think the absolute fastest timeline would be probably 2026, but that's very fast.
I mean, are you looking at a year of construction?
It would be phased. So, you know, it's likely that we would, have to build some sort of temporary, or it wouldn't necessarily be temporary, but smaller structure on site that was done at the other reservoirs while they're being constructed to hold water and maintain pressure. And so that could be one phase, and then we have some time in between that. And then there's the demolition, which is gonna be, you know, trucks coming in and out of the site. And then there's the excavation, trucks coming in and out of the site, and then the actual construction and the pour of the concrete. So it really depends on, you know, how we want to do this with the community. There's options, like we can take longer and phase it in such a way that, or, you know, we could do it faster. It really just depends. That's what part of this preliminary design report is for, is to give us the recommendations on how long those things would take, what they would cost. You know, how do we want to schedule and sequence that work?
And it would be a poured in place concrete reservoir.
Yeah, I mean, in most circumstances I can think of, unless we use some crazy technology, that we would be doing some sort of concrete structure.
Ted, you just need a motion from us to move forward with this?
Yeah, I mean, so what we're asking for is basically a recommendation to the council that we proceed with the plan to replace and to move on to the preliminary design report.
So move from
phase.
Trevino. Make a motion to move forward with this.
I'll second.
Do you want to take roll on that?
You don't need my credit card. do you?
I think I have it already, actually.
Have it
So
already?
Okay, we have a motion by Commissioner Trevino and a second by Commissioner Hernandez. We're gonna do a quick roll call for the motion. Chair Malling,
Yes.
Vice Chair Catania, Commissioner Hernandez, Commissioner Trevino, Commissioner Jones.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Well, good. I think with that, Reina, we're gonna motion with regards to the minutes for September 14th.
Yes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of
So
September?
move, Trevino.
Okay,
And I'll second that.
okay. Okay, quick roll call on the approval of the minutes from September 14th. Chair Malling, yes. Vice Chair Catania. Commissioner Hernandez,
Yes.
Commissioner Trevino, yes. And Commissioner Jones.
Yes. President.
You can abstain if you,
Abstain, then.
not a problem. We could just put that the minutes pass with a 4 approval and one abstain. Okay, not a problem. We could note that.
Well, good. With that said, we have our city council person here, Evelyn.
Yes.
You have the floor.
I don't have much, but I wanted to express my gratitude to the dedication and hard work of Public Works, especially they were so busy with the storms and overflows and flooding. And so thank you so much. And That's it.
Great. Well, thank you. With that said, commissioners, communications, before we get the other commissioners to speak, Brian, would you like to just tell us a little bit about yourself and welcome to, our Public Works, Commissioners group?
Thank you. I have no idea what I should be saying about myself. Let's see, South Pasadena now for 5 or 6 years. My wife and I have been here, have a 3-year-old. A ton to say about myself. Not an engineer, no, in the lumber business. Went to law school, did nothing with it. Might be about it.
Well, good. Well, thank you very much. With that said, I'll open it up to the other commissioners if they'd like to say anything. Sam, you always have something to say.
Well, no, I really don't this evening, except I'll
New Year's
mention,
resolution,
the
okay.
fact that we had, and I know Evelyn was with us. We had a wonderful crunch party over at the War Memorial, and the crunch party, as we all know, is to kick off the new year and pay off the old float. We are 110 years of self-built float here in the city. We are the oldest. And thanks to the wonderful crew that we have and have had, this is the 4th year in a row that we've won an award. We won the Bob Hope Humor Award, and which was wonderful. And I know that Evelyn worked her little fingers to the bone. The night before, the night after, and everything in between. She's a great sponsor and supporter of our crunch party and our float. So I thank you, and I thank everyone that's participated in it. We plan on doing it again this coming year, as we always have, and no matter how tough things may seem, we always seem to get through, and it's wonderful. So thank you. Other than that, I can talk about the chamber, but I won't even get into that. So thank you.
Sure. Anything else,
Thank you.
Charles?
On Tuesday, the Metropolitan Board gave final approval to $500,000 pilot project for South Pasadena on wastewater. Where are we with that project?
Sure, and thank you so much, Commissioner Trevino. So this is the project that we had proposed in the Hope and Mound parking lot. And the idea is that it is a stormwater capture project, and we would basically install cisterns underground in the parking lot here. And we would be able to draw dry and wet weather water, so from storms and also from runoff irrigation into the system, and then use it to irrigate some of the landscaping in this area or other non-potable uses throughout the city. So that was great news to hear that the item had passed. We had applied for a stormwater for direct use grant from Metropolitan Water District with the support of the Upper District. And so our next step is to actually enter into an agreement, a 3-way agreement with the Upper District, Metropolitan, and the city, and then start the procurement process to move into the design phase. We had talked real briefly about whether that would be a good project for a design build scenario in which it sort of moves along faster, and especially with the very unique technology that we'll be using, because it's basically these vertical silos that get augered into the ground. But we still have to look at our procurement practices and see if that's feasible. Otherwise, we'd move on to the design phase of that project next. So we have an agreement to get executed, and then some procurement information to figure out, and then we can move forward with the project. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, you see, all these rains that we've had, wow. If we had that in place, that would be so awesome.
Yeah, we think about that too. While we're trying to manage the impacts of the rains, we think about all this water that we could have captured had we had
could have
some
captured a lot of
projects
water,
in
yeah.
place.
I have one other thing, if I may. I was talking to Commissioner Mallon about this. You know, one thing that being on the Metropolitan Board, when I was on the board, we talked about different pilot projects. That was one of them was that wastewater project for South Pasadena. The other project that we talked about, I was on the Engineering Operations Committee, is doing another pilot project in another city on gray water. That if Metropolitan was to be able to offset the costs of retrofitting some homes for gray water capture, would homeowners be interested in that? Have you thought about that?
Absolutely. So yeah, we definitely think there's an interest in the city for a gray water program. We actually through our environmental commission, we considered how to set up that project. Ultimately, we shied away from the configuration where, you know, the city was doing some sort of installation in people's homes. So we basically came up with a rebate program where people can, if they're interested in doing a gray water installation, they can apply to the city to cover some of the costs of their installation. So we have some funds that city council had dedicated to that. And right now, the next step is to work with our environmental and sustainability group on just setting up the rebate program. We already have rebate programs for installing water saving appliances and for replacing turf and installing native plants. So we're actually just going to make that gray water rebate program, installation rebate program, an extension of our existing sustainable rebate program. So that's our next step.
Yeah. I think that working with Upper District and to put together some kind of proposal to Metropolitan about the gray water program that is being put forth here by the city, I think it's something for us to look at.
That would be fantastic. Metropolitan currently co-funds our turf replacement program, as you know, and some of our appliance replacement programs. So to expand that program with Metropolitan would be fantastic.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
great. Thank you.
Anything else, Frank? Well, good. Staff liaison, communications, Rena, you or Ted or Nat want to say anything or?
Nothing from me.
I don't think we have anything else to add either.
Well,
Yes.
happy New Year's.
New Year.
Smooth transition. Let's keep on going here. Let's keep the water, the electricity and the power and everything else going. So thank you very much. That concludes our meeting tonight. And we will get back to you on March 8th to be at 6:30 here. Thank you.
Thank you. Meeting is adjourned at 7:33.
1 hour. Well, I was stunned by Sam